Hello, welcome to the first video for Chapter 3 of Basic Sentential Logic and Formal Fallacies and Cognitive Biases. I'm going to be introducing the material in these videos in the same order I introduce them in the regular lecture, which is a little bit different from in the textbook. And that's partially on purpose. I think some students benefit from having the material introduced in slightly different ways. So in this video, I'm going to just basically introduce the proof method and then also introduce two rules, Modus Ponens and Disjunctive Syllogism, and work through a few examples of those. So the first thing that is going to be a little bit different from what we did in Chapter 2 is we're going to represent arguments slightly differently. So in Chapters 1 and 2, what we've been doing is representing an argument with the premises and conclusion all numbered, conclusion last, a line separating premises and conclusion, and the therefore, like this. What we're going to do now is we're just going to move the conclusion off to the side. The reason we're going to do that is we want to create space underneath the premises. So we're going to move the conclusion off to the side after a slash. That's just going to be a sort of visual reminder that this is the conclusion. And then get rid of the line and the conclusion down here. So it's a pretty minor change. And again, the reason is that we're going to be we want to create some space underneath these premises. And here's why. So what I'm going to do now is basically just walk through an example proof. At this point, you're not going to understand some of the details, and that's perfectly fine. I just want to give you a visual of how it works. So here's an argument. And we're going to use the proof method to show that this argument is valid. How does that work? Well, the proof method hinges on rules. In Chapter 3, we get inference rules. In Chapter 4, we'll have replacement rules. But they're all rules that allow us to create new lines underneath the premises. So, and the goal is to create a new line that's identical to the conclusion, or to put it another way, to derive the conclusion. So how does that work? Well, for instance, on this proof, the first thing I would do is I would create a new line 3, not D. How did I get that? Where did this come from? Well, over here we have, well, first, this is the new line that I derived, okay? And then over here is what we call the justification. This is the rule that I used in order to derive the line. Simplification is the name of the rule, and I'll introduce that later. And I used the rule of simplification on line 2. Just as a quick preview, what the rule of simplification says is if you have a conjunction, you can write a new line consisting of either conjunct by itself. So this is line 2 is a conjunction, so I wrote the first conjunct on a line by itself. So this is just the new line. This is the rule that I used and the line I applied that rule to. And I just keep doing that. I can then use the rule of DS on lines 3 and 1 to get this statement. Don't worry about DS now. I'm just sort of giving you a rough idea. Do simplification on line 2 to get G. And then finally, I can derive not E by modus tollens on 4 and 5. Again, don't worry about these rules. I'm going to introduce these and walk you through. But the point is that if you look, you can see that what I've done is I've used the rules to just keep deriving new lines until I managed to derive a line that's identical to the conclusion. So I managed to derive the conclusion using the rules. And if you can do that, that shows that the argument is valid. Now, you might wonder, why does that work? How is it that just using these rules like this to derive these lines shows that the argument's valid? I'll be talking about that in the next video. For now though, what I want to do is introduce the first two rules and we'll work through some examples so you can start getting used to how this functions and start doing proofs on your own. So the first rule is Modus Ponens. And for each rule that we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you two things. I'm going to give you a sort of visual schematic of the rule, and that's what this is, and a written or verbal description. And you should sort of know both. The verbal description is more important in some respects because the visual schematic can be misleading in some ways that I'll talk about. But the visual schematic is really good because it's a quick way to remember the rule. So what is the rule of modus ponens? Well, the visual or the written version is this. If you have a conditional on a line, and you can see in the schematic, that's if alpha then beta would be a conditional that maybe you already have somewhere. Maybe it's a premise, maybe it's one of the lines you've already derived, but somewhere you've got a conditional on your proof already. And you also, on another line, have the antecedent of that conditional. So the conditional is if alpha then beta, and on another line I have alpha. Well, the rule says that if I have these two pieces already, if I already have these parts, then if I want to, I can write a new line consisting of just the consequent of that conditional. Okay, so the rule requires certain pieces to already be there, and if those pieces are there, the rule says you can write a new line that has a certain form. Okay, if you have a conditional and you have the antecedent of that conditional, you can derive the consequent by itself on a new line. Okay, next rule. Disjunctive syllogism, DS. The rule says that if you have a disjunction on a line, so here's a disjunction, alpha or beta. Again, notice that in this schematic, these are statement variables. So these disjuncts could be atomic or compound, it doesn't matter. But if you have a disjunction on a line, and you have the negation of either disjunct. It could be the negation, here it's the negation of the first, but it could also be the negation of the second. I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you have the negation of either disjunct, then you can write a new line consisting of the other disjunct. Right, so here I have alpha or beta. I have the negation of alpha, so I can write beta. So I said that sometimes the schematics can be slightly misleading. And this is just what I meant. If you look at this visual schematic, you might think, oh, it has to be the negation of the first disjunct. Because the visual schematic, it's the first disjunct. And that's not quite right. If you actually look at the verbal description, it says if you have a disjunction and the negation of either disjunct, you can write a new line consisting of the other one. So that's sometimes why the verbal description is a little better. It doesn't say that it had to be the first one or the second one. It could be either one. Which means that we could have written this this way. I could have written it as alpha or beta, not beta, therefore alpha, right? Disjunction, negation of the second, so I derive the first. Okay. Also, this is going to be important. When in the rule it says negation, so if I have a disjunction and I have the negation of either disjunct, I can negate a statement, or I have the negation of a statement, so long as it has either one more or one less tilde. So in the original version of the rule, this is the negation of that because this has one more tilde. But it could also be this is the negation of that because it has one less. Either way, this is the negation of that disjunct. Okay, so I could have written the rule this way also. I also could have written it this way, right? Disjunction, this is the negation of the second disjunct. Okay, so I derived the first disjunct by itself. Okay, so those are the first two rules. Let's see, before I move into example, one other thing. In all of the schematics so far, the disjunction has been above the negated disjunct, but that doesn't matter, right? Again, if you look at the verbal description, it just says, if you have a disjunction on a line and the negation of either disjunct on another line, it leaves it open as to which one is above the other one. It doesn't matter. They just have to be up there somewhere. So we could also have written it this way. I have a disjunction, I have the negation of the first disjunct, I could derive the second. Okay, so with these two rules, modus ponens and disjunctive syllogism, let's do some examples. So here's a proof. This is an argument, and we want to show that this argument is valid. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to put the schematics of both of the rules up here just to remind us of the two rules. Can we apply either of these? Well, let's look at ds first. So what ds says we need is we need a disjunction and we need a negation of one of the disjuncts. Do we have these two pieces up here anywhere? Well, you can see we don't, that we don't have any disjunctions at all. Okay, so there's no way we could use ds. We just don't have the pieces that ds says we need to have. What about modus ponens? Can we use that one? Well, modus ponens says we need two pieces. We need a conditional and we need the antecedent of that conditional. And you can see we have that. Line 1 is a conditional. If A and B, then C. And line 2 is the antecedent, right? The antecedent of this is A and B, and sure enough, we have that antecedent on a line by itself. So we have the parts that modus ponens says we need. And modus ponens says if we have those two pieces, then the thing we can do is, if we want to, we can write the consequent of that conditional on a line by itself. Well, what's the consequent? The consequent is C. So modus ponens says we could write C on a line by itself. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to write a new line, number 3, C, and then I have to put the justification in. And the justification describes how I got that line. And I got it by using the rule of modus ponens on lines 1 and 2. Okay? Doesn't matter what order you cite these in. It could have been 2, 1. It just has to be the whatever two lines were the two pieces that I needed to use this rule. Okay? And you can see I'm done because this proof only took one step, right? Because C is the conclusion. So we've shown that this argument is valid because we managed to derive the conclusion using the rules from the premises. Let's do another example. This argument has 3 premises. The conclusion is not Q. I'm going to put our 2 rules up here again. One thing I want to mention now is that how should you go about memorizing these rules? What a lot of students do, right now we only have these 2, but altogether there will be 6 in the regular material for Chapter 3, 2 more in the optional material. How should you go about memorizing them? You should memorize them. What a lot of students do is they make flashcards, and then they just try to memorize the rules using flashcards. I do not recommend that. I mean, you can do it, but it's kind of a waste of time in a certain way. What you should do is kind of like what we're doing here. You should just do proofs. Initially, you don't have the rules memorized, so you're going to need to have a list of the rules next to you while you're doing them. Kind of like what I've done here. I've just put the rules down here to refer to while I'm doing the proof. And if I don't have the rules memorized, I'm going to need these down here in order to do the proof. But what will happen is that as I'm doing proofs and I'm referring to these rules to continue with the proof, I'm going to have to refer to these less and less as time goes on. After 3 or 4 times when I've had to look down to apply modus ponens, the 5th time I'm not going to have to look down because I've used it enough that now it's in my head. So that's the way to memorize the rules, is you just do proofs initially just with the list there. And you'll find that over time you're just referring to that list less and less. Okay, that's the way to get the rules memorized. Okay, but for now, let's assume we don't have them memorized, so I'm just going to write them down here. Can we use modus ponens? Well, again, we need a conditional and we need the antecedent of that conditional. Here's a conditional, if P then not Q. So I've got one of the pieces, I have a conditional. Do I have the other piece? Do I have the antecedent of that conditional anywhere? Well, the antecedent is P. I don't have P anywhere on a line by itself. P is here, okay, but it's not on a line by itself. It has to be by itself on a line, okay, just P, and I don't have that. So I can't use modus ponens. I don't have all of the necessary pieces. What about DS? Well, I need two pieces for DS. I need a disjunction, I need the negation of one of the disjuncts. Do I have that? Yeah, look, line 2 is a disjunction. Line 3 is the negation of that first disjunct. So I have the pieces I need to use DS. What does DS say I can do then? It says that if I have these two pieces, then I can derive the other disjunct, the one that wasn't negated. So here I've negated the first one, I can derive the second one. I've negated the first one, so I can derive the second. So I can get P on a line by itself. So I'm going to write P, and then my justification was I used the rule DS on 2 and 3. Now notice that now I do have this other piece I needed for modus ponens. I couldn't use modus ponens before, remember, because we had the conditional, but I didn't have P, but now I do have P. Okay, that's what I managed to get on line 4. So now I can use modus ponens on 1 and 4. I have a conditional, I have the antecedent of that conditional, so by modus ponens I can derive the consequent, not Q. Modus ponens on lines 1 and 4, not Q. And again, the order you cite these doesn't matter. This could have been 3-2 DS, this could have been 4-1 modus ponens, as long as you have the lines, the right lines cited. Okay, let's do another example. 3 premises, conclusion is not C. Again, I'm going to keep my rules down here just as a reminder because I don't have them memorized yet. I'm new to doing proofs. I'm just learning these. And so I'm just going to keep them there as long as I need them as I'm practicing proofs. And again, you'll see eventually you're going to stop having to refer to those because they'll just get worked into your brain through use. Okay, what can we do? Can we do modus ponens? Do we have a conditional and the antecedent? Yeah, here's a conditional. If not A, then B, and I have the antecedent here. So I could do modus ponens. What about disjunctive syllogism? Can I do that? Well, I do have a disjunction. Do I have the negation of either disjunct? I would either need C, that's the negation of this, or I would need B. And you can see I don't have either of those on line by itself. Their B is here, but it's not on a line by itself. So the only thing I can do is modus ponens on 1 and 3. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have a conditional, I have the antecedent, so I can derive the consequent on a line by itself. And that was modus ponens on 3 and 1. 1, 3 modus ponens. Now, you'll see I do have the pieces I need for disjunctive syllogism. Because now if we look at 2 and 4, I have a disjunction. I have the negation of the second disjunct. That's not B, I have B, the negation of that. So by DS, if I have a disjunction, I have the negation of one of the disjuncts, I can derive the other disjunct. So I have the negation of the second one, so I can derive the first. I can get not C. So line 5 will be not C. And I got that from lines 2 and 4 DS. Okay, so that's the end of this video. What we've done is I talked a little bit about the basic proof method, introduced it, and we've seen the first 2 rules so far, modus ponens and disjunctive syllogism. Also, keep in mind, the way to memorize the rules is not to use flashcards. A much better way is to just keep a list of the rules next to you as you're doing exercises, and you will memorize the rules that way just automatically. It's much more efficient because that way you're simultaneously learning the rules and getting good at proofs, which is way better than just getting good at just memorizing rules but still sucking at doing proofs. Okay, that's it for this video. Next up, I'm going to explain why this method works. Why is it that just using these rules to derive the conclusion shows that this argument is valid?